Underestimation is one of the most common and costly mistakes people make because it grows out of a mindset that feels safe but blinds us to reality. When you underestimate someone, you're not measuring their skill, you're projecting your assumptions onto them. You're deciding what they're capable of based on a snapshot, a label, a uniform, or the role they happen to hold at the moment. It's a shortcut the mind loves because it saves time, but it's also a trap because it shuts down curiosity and blocks you from seeing potential until it's too late. The damage usually shows up quietly at first. Maybe you ignore someone's ideas because they don't talk like an expert. Maybe you overlook their input because their job title doesn't impress you. Maybe you assume they're not educated enough, experienced enough, or polished enough to contribute at a high level. You brush off small signs of competence or insight because they contradict the story you've already written about them. But eventually reality breaks through, and when it does, it exposes how flawed that story was from the beginning. Underestimation is expensive for teams and organizations because it keeps real talent on the sidelines. People who could solve problems, improve processes, or even lead effectively get stuck in low-visibility roles simply because others around them never looked past the surface. That kind of blindness doesn't just hurt the person being overlooked, it hurts the entire system. Work slows down. Innovation stalls. High-level discussions get trapped within the same narrow circle of voices. When only the expected experts speak, you rarely hear the perspective that changes everything. Progress demands someone who sees the world differently, someone who notices the detail the specialists miss, someone who blends practical experience with raw intuition. Often, that person is the one nobody ever thought to ask. What makes underestimation so persistent is that it feels harmless. People don't think of themselves as dismissive. They think of themselves as rational. They trust credentials, formal roles, and outward confidence because those cues simplify decision-making. But the danger is that those cues only reflect part of the truth. A person can have a degree and no insight. A person can have no degree and enormous skill. A person can have a quiet personality and sharp intelligence. A person can have a rough job title and a mind that can reverse engineer complex machinery. When we underestimate someone, we're not evaluating their ability. We're evaluating our comfort with how they present themselves. And comfort is a terrible metric for talent. There's also a psychological layer to underestimation. People often protect their own sense of expertise by assuming others know less. It's easier to maintain authority when you downplay the potential of the people around you. But that protectionism backfires. It creates environments where people stop sharing ideas because they've learned the room won't listen. It sends the message that brilliance is only valid when it comes from a certain type of person. Over time, that message builds resentment, discourages initiative, and strips organizations of the diversity of thought they desperately need. When people feel undervalued, they stop trying. When they stop trying, the team loses its most powerful fuel, engaged minds. The cost also shows up in missed moments, the ones where someone could have stepped in, spoken up, or contributed something transformative, but didn't, because they were never taken seriously. That's when the price of underestimation becomes painfully clear. You realize the solution was in the room the entire time, but you were too focused on hierarchy to notice. You realize the quiet observer knew more than the loudest expert. You realize the person doing the least glamorous job had been paying attention, had been learning, had been sharpening their skills in ways you didn't bother to imagine. And by the time the truth reveals itself, it's usually in a moment of crisis, when everything is on the line and the standard playbook has failed. Underestimation also robs you of the chance to be surprised in the best way. There's something powerful about discovering hidden brilliance in someone you overlooked. It reminds you that talent doesn't announce itself. It reminds you that skill can grow in silence. It reminds you that the world is full of people who have learned by doing, studying after hours, experimenting quietly, or absorbing knowledge from life itself. When you underestimate those people, you miss the richness of what they bring. You miss the creativity that comes from unconventional paths. You miss the resilience that comes from people who had to earn every inch of their expertise without recognition. If you trace the arc of any great turnaround, any unexpected victory, or any breakthrough solution, you'll almost always find someone in the background who wasn't given much credit at first. Someone who worked without praise. Someone who paid attention. Someone who mastered their craft when nobody was watching. Those are the people underestimated the most, and the ones who often reshape the story when everything is on the brink. Expertise can hide in plain sight when people rely on surface-level cues to decide who's worth listening to. A title, a uniform, a resume, or a workplace hierarchy becomes a filter, and anything that doesn't pass through that filter gets dismissed before it's even understood. The problem is that real skill doesn't always live where people expect it. It doesn't always look polished or packaged. Sometimes it grows in the margins, carried by someone who learned through experience instead of formal paths, someone who paid attention while others weren't watching, someone who had to work twice as hard just to be seen. When you assume expertise only belongs to the people in the spotlight, you overlook the people whose abilities were shaped in the shadows. The world trains people to connect competence with presentation. Confident speakers get labeled as leaders. People with degrees get labeled as experts. Those with technical vocabulary get treated as the only ones capable of understanding complex problems. Meanwhile, the people who work quietly, who observe more than they talk, who build skill through repetition rather than recognition, stay invisible. But invisibility has nothing to do with value. There are people performing routine jobs who understand machinery better than the engineers who designed it. There are people with unassuming roles who can troubleshoot failures faster than supervisors because they've spent years dealing with the consequences others overlook. There are workers who learn systems inside out because they handle them daily, even though nobody thinks of them as specialists. What makes hidden expertise so powerful is the way it develops. Without the pressure of defending a title or maintaining professional status, people can explore, practice, and experiment freely. They make mistakes without fear of judgment. They chase curiosity without worrying whether it fits their job description. Over time, that curiosity compounds into real competence. They become the person who knows how something works not because they were trained to, but because they cared enough to figure it out. This creates a deep, intuitive understanding that formal training doesn't always match. And yet, because they don't carry the expected signals of expertise, others assume they don't know much at all. Another layer is that people often underestimate how quickly knowledge spreads in environments where different roles overlap. The janitor sweeping the hangar floor hears conversations between mechanics. The assistant stocking shelves in a lab sees which tools get used the most. The worker repairing small issues every day develops a feel for what's about to break before the sensors catch it. This kind of osmosis-based learning is powerful. It teaches patterns, habits, weak points, and workarounds. It teaches what theory misses. But because it comes without certificates or official recognition, people overlook the expertise that grows from exposure and repetition. Bias plays a role too. Humans like clean categories. When someone is labeled as support staff, helpers, maintenance, or junior, people subconsciously assign limits to what that person can do. Those limits rarely reflect reality. They reflect bias about education, background, personality, language, or appearance. That bias blinds people to talent sitting right in front of them. It creates workplaces where potential stays buried simply because it doesn't look the way people expect talent to look. And when a crisis hits and the usual experts run out of solutions, that hidden potential suddenly becomes a lifeline. When someone with no status solves a problem everyone else failed to crack, the moment feels shocking, almost unbelievable. But the truth is, the skill didn't materialize out of nowhere. It was there the entire time. It was built through small observations, constant exposure, private practice, and a genuine interest in the craft. The only reason it feels surprising is because people weren't paying attention. They were too focused on hierarchy to notice competence developing outside their field of vision. The gap wasn't in the other person's skill, it was in their ability to be recognized. Ignoring hidden expertise also comes with a cost. Teams lose the advantage of having more perspectives. Innovation gets limited to the same predictable thinkers. Leaders miss out on spotting rising talent before it's needed. And the organization learns an unhealthy lesson that only certain voices matter. When that mindset spreads, people with potential stay silent. They hold back their ideas, their observations, and sometimes even their solutions because they assume nobody wants to hear from them. That silence can slow progress in ways that become obvious only later. In reality, expertise doesn't care about job titles. Skill doesn't ask for permission. Knowledge doesn't wait for a promotion to show up. It grows wherever someone is paying attention, practicing, and pushing themselves out of genuine interest. That means the person everyone overlooks might be the one who sees the answer first. The worker who receives the least recognition might be the one who understands the system most deeply. And the person assumed to know the least might be the one holding the insight that changes everything. Pressure doesn't honor titles, credentials, or reputation. When the clock is ticking and the stakes jump from theoretical to real, people reveal their true level of preparation. Some freeze because their confidence was built on routine and predictability. Some become frantic, relying on authority they can no longer lean on. And then there are the ones who stay calm, who have been preparing long before anyone noticed, who treat pressure not as a threat, but as a signal that it's time to act. They're not always the people with the biggest roles or the loudest voices. Often, they're the ones nobody paid attention to until that moment. Pressure has a way of stripping away illusions and exposing who actually knows what they're doing. In everyday situations, it's easy to assume competence. When nothing is going wrong, almost anyone can appear in control. Scripts work. Protocols hold. People can coast on polished communication or the confidence that comes from routine repetition. But pressure interrupts all of that. It disrupts the pattern and forces people to make decisions without the comfort of predictability. That's where preparation becomes visible. People who only know the steps fall apart when the steps change. People who understand the system adapt because they aren't relying on memorization. They're relying on comprehension. Pressure demands that. It doesn't care about textbook knowledge. It cares about whether you genuinely understand what you're dealing with. You can see this in any high-intensity environment. Some people perform well in practice but crumble during real tests because their knowledge is superficial. Other people may seem quiet during planning sessions but dominate when everything hits the fan because they've internalized the mechanics, the patterns, and the consequences. They've spent time thinking, troubleshooting, and learning deeply rather than performing competence during calm moments. Pressure reveals who practiced for real and who practiced for show. It exposes who has been coasting behind appearance and who has been quietly building substance. Another reason pressure unmasks true skill is that it takes away the luxury of ego. There's no time to posture. There's no room for insecurity. People who rely on status for validation often hesitate under pressure because their identity feels threatened. If they make the wrong call, their image cracks. Meanwhile, the people who are driven by mastery rather than ego move faster and more clearly. Their decisions come from understanding, not fear. They don't worry about how they look. They worry about solving the problem. That simple shift in motivation becomes a major advantage when the clock is running. Pressure also reveals who has been paying attention. Some people walk through their days unconsciously, doing tasks but not learning from them. Others absorb everything around them. The mistakes, the processes, the failures, the small details most people ignore. Over time, that attention builds a mental toolbox far more valuable than memorized instructions. When a crisis hits, the person who paid attention sees shortcuts, patterns, and workarounds the surface-level expert doesn't. They can improvise because they understand why things work, not just how they're supposed to work. There's another side to this. Pressure exposes who can stay emotionally steady. Skill isn't only about technical knowledge. It's also about composure. People who panic under stress lose access to their own ability. Their minds narrow, their reactions slow, and their judgment fogs. People who remain centered, because they've lived through enough challenges to trust themselves, gain clarity when others lose it. They can think, adjust, and communicate in a way that stabilizes the environment rather than adding to the chaos. This emotional steadiness is often overlooked until the moment it becomes the most important asset in the room. In many cases, The people who excel under pressure are the ones who have lived with pressure quietly for years. The person who had to solve problems without recognition learns resilience. The worker who always dealt with the broken equipment before the experts arrived learns troubleshooting. The individual who had to figure things out alone develops independence of thought. Those experiences forge a kind of readiness that doesn't show during calm days, but becomes undeniable when the situation gets unstable. They've been training for the moment without even knowing it. When everyone is comfortable, assumptions about capability go unchallenged. Teams believe the person with the highest rank is the most prepared. Leaders assume the most confident communicator is the smartest voice. But pressure tests those assumptions. It highlights who was relying on their title and who was relying on their talent. It exposes whose preparation was real and whose was performative. And once pressure lifts, people remember who stepped up, who broke, who froze, and who quietly carried the situation. After that, titles feel less impressive, and true competence becomes impossible to ignore. Real skill doesn't wait for approval. It doesn't ask for a platform, a title, or an invitation to prove itself. It shows up when there's a problem to solve, when something breaks, when everyone else hesitates, or when the usual experts run out of answers. Skill is driven by ability, not authority. People who truly know what they're doing don't sit around waiting for someone to grant them permission. They step in because they understand the work, they see what needs to happen, and they trust their own preparation. That trust is what separates real competence from the appearance of competence. One is quiet but reliable. The other is loud but fragile. When a situation demands action and not debate, the difference becomes impossible to miss. A lot of environments unintentionally condition people to wait for instructions. Chains of command, approval layers, and rigid hierarchies create a culture where stepping forward feels risky. People learn to default to the person with the highest rank rather than the person with the deepest understanding. But real skill breaks through that conditioning. When someone knows their craft well enough, hesitation fades. They don't jump in for attention. They jump in because the solution is obvious to them. They see the steps clearly. They recognize the mistake instantly. They know how to stabilize the situation because they've built that knowledge through repetition and insight, not through memorized procedures. There's a misconception that the most skilled people are the ones who constantly talk about their expertise. That's often not true. The loudest voice in the room might know the least. Real skill doesn't need to advertise itself because it isn't built for show. It's built for outcomes. You see it when someone moves with intent, when they handle a problem with precision, when they diagnose an issue in seconds that others have been debating for hours. They don't need praise. They don't need authority. Their actions do the talking, and their results make the case that no title could strengthen. Another reason real skill doesn't wait for permission is because its foundation is understanding, not fear. People who rely on their status worry about making mistakes. They hesitate because their identity is tied to being seen as competent. People with genuine skill see mistakes as part of the process. They've made enough of them to know how to recover. That familiarity removes fear, and without fear, they're free to act. They trust their hands, their mind, their experience. That trust becomes a form of internal authority, stronger than any external approval they're supposed to wait for. In high-pressure moments, this difference becomes even clearer. When something breaks and everyone looks around for who's in charge, real skill moves before hierarchy catches up. It doesn't ask whether it's allowed to participate. It sees the gap and fills it. That's why the most capable person in a critical situation is often someone who wasn't on anyone's radar. They leaned in when others backed off. They acted when others hesitated. Their confidence didn't come from being told they were the expert. It came from knowing they had the ability to fix the issue. That internal certainty is what gives them the courage to take initiative when others are waiting for instructions. People who possess real skill usually gained it in environments where they had to rely on themselves. They learned by doing, experimenting, troubleshooting, breaking things, and rebuilding them. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for permission because waiting meant something stayed broken. Over time, that constant exposure to real problems shaped a mindset where ownership feels natural. They don't see stepping in as overstepping. They see it as responsibility. That mindset is rare in systems built on rigid chains of command, which is why it stands out so sharply when it appears. There's also a humility embedded in genuine skill. It's not about proving superiority. It's about solving the problem. Because they don't act from ego, they're not trying to overshadow anyone. They're focused on the task, not the recognition. Ironically, this humility often makes them invisible until a crisis reveals them. When the system is running smoothly, nobody notices the quiet person who fixes small issues before they become big ones. But when chaos hits, that same person becomes impossible to ignore. Their readiness becomes the anchor the situation needed. What often surprises people is how natural the transition looks when someone skilled takes over. There's no dramatic announcement, no speech. They just start working. Others instinctively follow their lead because competence is recognizable even when it's unexpected. Clarity under pressure, precision in action, and calm decision-making signal to everyone around them that this person knows what they're doing. Permission becomes irrelevant at that point. Skill commands its own space. And afterward, when the moment has passed, people often reflect on how they never realized that person knew so much. They wonder where that level of capability came from. But the truth is, it was always there. It just didn't need a spotlight to exist. Real skill doesn't wait to be invited. It steps forward the second it's needed, whether anyone expects it or not. A single act of unexpected competence can reset an entire culture because it forces people to confront what they've been blind to. Most workplaces operate on assumptions built over years. Who's smart? Who's average? Who the go-to person is? Who the background workers are? Who leads and who follows. These assumptions become so ingrained that people stop questioning them. They treat their labels as facts. But when someone flips the script, when the person everyone underestimated solves the problem no one else could, it shakes the foundation of those assumptions. It tells everyone that their understanding of talent wasn't just incomplete, but inaccurate. Moments like that cut through politics and hierarchy. They expose how fragile perception-based systems really are. It only takes one moment of undeniable competence to make people rethink how they distribute respect, attention, and responsibility. The reason it hits so hard is because it makes people confront their own biases. They realize they weren't evaluating ability. They were evaluating status. They realized they confused visibility with value. They realized they let familiarity dictate respect instead of letting results do the talking. And once that realization hits, the old way of seeing people doesn't hold the same weight anymore. When someone unexpected shines, it changes how others behave. People become more aware of the talent that exists around them, not just the talent they're used to seeing. They start listening more carefully. They question their assumptions about who might have insight. They leave more room for different voices to contribute. And slowly, the culture shifts from one that assumes to one that observes. From one that judges too quickly to one that stays open. From one that waits for authority to speak to one that recognizes competence wherever it appears. That shift can change everything from teamwork to communication to problem solving. Just as importantly, a moment of unexpected excellence can empower people who have been holding back. When they see someone like them, someone with a modest title, a quiet personality, or a role that usually gets overlooked, step up and outperform the supposed experts, it sends a message. It tells them that their value isn't determined by their title. It tells them that contribution isn't limited to the chosen few. It tells them that preparation matters more than position. People who may have felt invisible begin to recognize their own potential. They start speaking up, sharing ideas, and taking ownership in ways they hadn't before. That kind of empowerment snowballs. When one person breaks through, others follow. A culture that once dismissed certain voices begins to discover that those same voices were carrying insight the whole time. Confidence spreads. Initiative grows. The environment becomes less about waiting for permission and more about stepping up when you have something real to offer. The ripple effect of a single impressive moment can reshape the energy of an entire team. People start working with a sense of possibility instead of a sense of limitation. On the flip side, that moment also shifts how leaders lead. When someone unexpected solves a critical issue, leaders are forced to rethink how they evaluate talent. They start asking deeper questions. Who else holds knowledge we've been overlooking? Who else sees problems differently? Who else might be capable of stepping into bigger responsibilities? This introspection can lead to a wider distribution of trust, more inclusive decision-making, and a greater willingness to develop talent from unlikely places. The system becomes more dynamic because it's no longer built on narrow assumptions. Another powerful effect is how such a moment recalibrates respect. When a person surprises everyone with their capability, respect becomes tied to results rather than rank. People start paying attention to consistency, preparation, and understanding instead of charisma or authority. This creates a healthier environment where people earn influence based on what they contribute rather than who they appear to be. When respect gets rebalanced like that, it encourages accountability and raises the bar for the entire group. Unexpected competence also challenges complacency. It shows everyone that expertise isn't locked into titles or seniority. It can emerge from any corner of the room. When people see that, they can't rely on old assumptions or coast on their reputation. They realize they have to stay sharp, keep learning, and maintain humility. They understand that no one is untouchable and no role is insignificant. That awareness pushes people to put in real work instead of leaning on the comfort of their position. Sometimes the most meaningful part of a breakthrough moment is how it exposes the difference between potential and recognition. Someone might have had the ability the entire time, but lacked the platform to show it. When they finally get that moment, by chance or by necessity, it becomes a turning point not just for them, but for everyone observing. People realize that potential is everywhere, not just in the places they're used to looking. Once that realization takes hold, the culture shifts permanently. People stop assuming they know where brilliance will come from. They start giving others space to rise. And in that space, the entire organization becomes smarter, stronger, and more resilient. Respect everyone because you never know who holds the solution you'll depend on. It sounds simple, but most people don't live by it. They treat respect as something distributed according to rank, status, salary, or social standing. They respect upward, tolerate sideways, and often dismiss downward. They don't realize that the person they overlook today might be the person they need tomorrow. They don't realize that skill doesn't follow hierarchy and that brilliance doesn't announce itself. It shows up in people who look ordinary, speak quietly, or stand in roles that society undervalues. When you fail to respect those people, you're not just being unkind. You're sabotaging your own access to solutions, insight, and support. Respecting everyone doesn't mean assuming everyone is an expert in everything. It means recognizing that every person holds knowledge you don't. The maintenance worker knows the building's weak spots better than the executives. The operator on the floor knows which machines are most likely to fail long before the data catches up. The janitor knows the flow of the environment better than people who only pass through it. The driver, the assistant, the clerk, the technician, each one has a front row seat to a part of reality others don't see. They notice patterns, shortcuts, issues, and opportunities that people in higher positions miss because the system shields them from that level of detail. When you dismiss someone due to their role, you're ignoring the unique intelligence that comes from living inside a perspective you don't have. People also underestimate how much hidden capability exists in unexpected places. Not everyone advertises their skills. Not everyone has been given the chance to show what they can do. Some people are experts in areas outside their job. Some learn through experience rather than a title. Some carry abilities they never talk about because they've learned that nobody listens. When you treat people with consistent respect, you open the door for those abilities to surface. When you dismiss them, those abilities stay hidden until the moment your team is stuck, unprepared, or out of options. That's when someone from the edges steps in with an answer that changes everything. Respect is also a form of access. When people feel respected, they open up. They share more. They warn you about problems sooner. They offer insights without being asked. They volunteer their perspective because they know it'll be taken seriously. Respect builds trust, and trust creates flow. Flow of information, ideas, solutions, and goodwill. Without respect, communication becomes guarded. People withhold concerns because they assume you don't care. They stop contributing ideas because they expect to be ignored. They stop trying to solve problems because experience taught them that only certain voices are valued. In that environment, even the smartest leaders operate half-blind. There's another layer to this. Respect generates loyalty. When people feel valued, they go the extra mile. They step up in moments of crisis. They come forward when a critical detail could prevent a disaster. They support you because they want to, not because they're obligated to. But when people feel dismissed, they disengage. They stop caring about outcomes beyond the minimum requirement. And in high-stakes moments, that disengagement shows. Problems that could have been prevented aren't. Solutions that could have been offered stay unspoken. Opportunities that depend on collective awareness slip through the cracks. Respect also changes how teams operate. When everyone is treated as if they matter, collaboration becomes genuine. People listen to each other instead of waiting for the highest-ranked person to speak. They evaluate ideas based on merit, not source. They develop a culture where insight is shared freely and where learning flows in every direction, not just top-down. This kind of environment is where innovation happens. It's where people spot problems earlier, fix things faster, and push each other to improve. Respect makes the team smarter because it unlocks the intelligence of every member, not just the ones at the top. In contrast, when respect is distributed unevenly, teams start functioning on assumptions rather than awareness. Leaders assume their perception is complete, even though they're often the farthest from the ground truth. Specialists assume nobody outside their field can offer relevant insight. People in entry-level or support roles assume they have no voice. All these assumptions create blind spots that only show themselves when something breaks, when the expert doesn't have the answer, and when the overlooked person suddenly becomes the only one who understands what's happening. That's when respect becomes more than a social nicety. It becomes a survival advantage. Respect also keeps your ego in check. When you assume you know more than someone because of your title, you stop learning. When you assume someone can't help you, you stop asking questions. You build an inner hierarchy based on your own comfort rather than on actual ability. Over time, that mindset makes people rigid, closed off, and unprepared for challenges that fall outside their expertise. But when you approach everyone with the assumption that they might know something you don't, you stay adaptable. You stay curious. You stay grounded enough to notice when someone else sees what you've missed. And the truth is, the world is full of people carrying knowledge, skill, and experience that would shock you if you took the time to look past the surface. The person you overlook might be the one who saves the day. The one you underestimate might be the one who hands you the answer you couldn't find. The one you ignore might hold the piece of insight that shifts everything. Respect keeps you open to those possibilities. Respect ensures you never block your own access to the talent around you. Respect turns every person into a potential partner instead of an unnoticed background figure.